Hey, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk a lot about Benny Goodman and his special place in swing culture. Then we're going to talk about the diversity, ethnic and racial diversity of swing culture. And then finally, some of the limitations of this diversity and where the limits were in terms of acceptance within swing culture for diversity. Now, Ehrenberg, in your chapter that deals a lot with Benny Goodman here, begins the chapter by comparing two concerts. Two concerts that were held for similar reasons. They were held in traditional classical music venues in New York City. And the purpose behind these concerts was to expose the audience to recent trends in jazz music. The first concert was in 1924 at Aeolian Hall. And it was a concert put on by a famous band leader at the time, Paul Whiteman. Paul Whiteman, who was known at the time as the King of Jazz. Now, this is 1924, so this is all pre-swing. And Whiteman played a kind of polite jazz music that most people today wouldn't even really call jazz, but was known as jazz at the time. And that whole title of King of Jazz was actually given to him by, I think, a soprano at the Metropolitan Opera. So it wasn't exactly the most discerning person when it came to who should be king of jazz. And Ehrenberg compares that concert, Whiteman's in 1924 at Aeolian Hall, to a later concert that Benny Goodman put on at Carnegie Hall, the bastion of American classical music, in 1938. And again, the premise was the same. Now, in 1938, swing music was the new hot trend in music. So the idea behind this concert was similar to the earlier idea of Whiteman's 1924 concert, which was to expose the audience to this new trend in jazz, at this time in terms of swing music. And so the premise behind both of these concerts was very similar. But as Ehrenberg points out in your book, the execution and what happened on those stages were very, very different. First of all, Paul Whiteman's band was all white. There were no African Americans on the stage. In fact, if you were there at the concert and listening to Paul Whiteman talk between songs, you wouldn't even really get the impression that African American people had much to do with this music at all. You would get the impression that this was a largely lily white form of music. So there wasn't much diversity either in the musical selection or the kinds of people that were on stage performing this music. Also, one of the implications clear from that evening's musical entertainment that while jazz was an interesting form of music, it was a form of music Whiteman believed that needed to be refined, it needed to be improved. What it really needed was a heavy dose of the white man's culture. That jazz music needed to be combined with European classical symphonic traditions to make it really good. In fact, the most remembered thing of this concert at Aeolian Hall was that Whiteman commissioned George Gershwin to write a song for that evening, and Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue, a very famous song that part of the innovation of Rhapsody of Blue was this attempt to combine American jazz with European symphonic traditions, as you have there. Well, Ehrenberg contrasts Whiteman's approach to jazz music to Benny Goodman's performance in 1938 at Carnegie Hall. Unlike Whiteman's performance, Benny Goodman had racial diversity and ethnic diversity on the stage. There were African American musicians that were playing in Goodman's band that night. We'll talk more later on about Goodman's decision to integrate his band, being the first of the white band leaders to integrate his band. There was also musical variety in terms of Goodman not only playing music from African American composers and arrangers, but openly acknowledging this, making sure the audience knew who these people were and giving credit for their music. And not only was the diversity black and white, but also Benny Goodman was Jewish, as we'll talk about. And some of the numbers he played were kind of revved up Yiddish numbers that reflected his own ethnic background. The reactions of the audiences were also interesting. The audience for Whiteman's concert in 1924 behaved, by all reports, much the way you would have expected a classical music audience to respond. They sat quietly, patiently during songs and then politely clapped once the song was over. But the audience at Goodman's show, they were screaming and they were shouting and they were standing up, and some of them were dancing in the aisles. There were even reports that you could smell the odor of marijuana that was being smoked during the show in there. Not a usual occurrence at Carnegie Hall back in the day. And so what Ehrenberg argues, and it gets to the thesis of his book, where he argues there was something essentially democratic and egalitarian and participatory about swing music. It allowed different types of people to be involved in the musical culture. It was more receptive to notions of equality, where you had African Americans not only on the stage but in the audience at Carnegie Hall that night, where the audience was allowed to participate and let their emotions fly in this. So Ehrenberg compares these two concerts because what's interesting is that they were both held for similar reasons: to expose what was supposed to have been a largely classical music audience to these new trends in jazz. But the execution and the approach to the music were so very different. And it reflected what Ehrenberg finds to be so important about swing music, that it wasn't just a great form of music. It wasn't just a form of music that was great to dance to, but it was a musical culture that made America a more tolerant place, a better place. And so that's why he's trying to get us ready to talk about Benny Goodman, because Benny Goodman in his own way is going to participate in that, right? So, this was the slide that we were talking about. That there's Paul Whiteman there. And by the way, I've sometimes had students write about Paul Whiteman in essays and in class papers, get really negative, like, Paul Whiteman, that son of a bitch. That Paul Whiteman was performing in 1924. Okay? He was largely operating within the confines of a racist, segregated American society. So, although he doesn't deserve some sort of accolades for bravery, it's not like he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan either at the time. Be somewhat understanding of the period of time that Paul Whiteman was operating in. Benny Goodman deserves credit for his participation in helping desegregate American music. But that doesn't mean Paul Whiteman was the exact opposite and some kind of evil, bad guy. He was just performing at a bit of a different time and wasn't stepping out to try and challenge American segregation. Guess what? In 1924, the vast majority of white Americans were not doing that. So maybe ease up on Paul Whiteman a little bit. Let's talk about Benny Goodman. Talk about his background, because this is going to be relevant to helping us understand some of his later decisions and his musical trajectory. Goodman was born in Chicago to immigrant parents. They came from the old Russian Empire at the end of the 1800s. Beginning of the 20th century was a particularly difficult time for Jews in Eastern Europe, increasing persecution against Jews at that time. And so some of them immigrated to the United States for better opportunities. So Goodman's family came and had a large family, 11 kids. Goodman was one of 11. Grew up very poor. Found a misspelled word. It's bothering me. Sorry about that. Grew up very poor. Again, that kind of difficult to scrape by working class experience that we've already been talking about in this class. One of the ways out of poverty was through music and becoming a professional musician. And when I mean out of poverty, I don't mean it as we might think of it more today, whereas you're poor and you want to get famous and you want to get rich, so you go into music. There were a lot more in the ways of just middle class options for playing and performing music. When Benny Goodman was a child, in the aughts and the teens, there wasn't that much recorded music. Records were a new thing, as we learned about in our last unit. And so most of the music people consumed back in those days was performed live. And so there were a lot of opportunities to be not necessarily famous, not necessarily rich, but to move into the upper working class, middle class status by being a musician who performed live. I talked about in one of the last lectures, restaurants used to have live musicians that would pay. And so I told you when we were talking about Hull House in our previous unit on silent movies that one of the places Benny Goodman would learn how to play clarinet was at Hull House. They offered music lessons at Hull House. In fact, had a very good teacher who played in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and Goodman got lessons there. He also got lessons from the family synagogue that also gave musical lessons. And this was more than just the reason why people would get musical training for their children today in terms of, enrichment. Part of the idea with this was you could be a professional musician and you could make a living. Even if you didn't get to be famous or rich like Goodman did, you could make a living being a professional musician. And so that was part of the family's idea for getting him to learn music. He was a prodigy. He was very good at music. By the age of 12, he was earning money. As a 14-year-old, he was performing professionally in there. So he was already making a living at one point fairly early on. There were times when Benny Goodman was making more money playing music than his father was making. So he was helping out the family that you got there. Now, Chicago in the teens and into the early 20s was actually the center of American jazz. There was a sort of migration of the center of American jazz. We associate the beginnings of jazz with New Orleans, and I think I've argued in an earlier lecture, St. Louis very much gets underplayed in terms of its importance in the development of jazz. By the later teens and into the 20s, some of those New Orleans and St. Louis musicians had migrated up the river, up the Mississippi to Chicago. Okay, more opportunities. Some of the African American musicians were fleeing some of the increasingly difficult racial prejudice in New Orleans, and things were a little bit better up in Chicago. Goodman just so happened to be born in the city that was going to have this really vibrant jazz tradition as he was a child and he was a teenager. And this was going to filter into white communities, particularly working class white communities, this interest in jazz. There was one high school in Chicago called Austin High School that actually produced a lot of famous white jazz musicians of this era. Max Friedman, Bud Kaminsky. Goodman didn't go to this high school, but he became friends with a number of the guys, and they came to be known as the Austin High Gang. That was sort of a breeding ground of white jazz musicians of the time. Goodman started to pal around and hang out with these guys. Now, one of the things we associate with a lot of these Chicago jazz musicians, and this holds for New York and a lot of other big cities, that because working class whites in big cities often lived in close proximity to African Americans because of their poor surroundings that they grew up in. They often lived either in black neighborhoods or nearby African American neighborhoods, that white working class kids often got more exposed to jazz music than, say, if they were from the middle class or the upper class that weren't exposed to this music. Another good example of how this worked, in fact, my favorite one, is early rock and roll in the early 1950s and middle 1950s. If you look at the early rock and rollers, the early white rock and rollers, Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash. One of the similarities to almost all of these guys is that they all grew up really poor in the South. And just like I'm talking about with Goodman and these white working class jazz musicians, those early rock and rollers like Elvis grew up in close proximity to African Americans in the South. So they imbibed black music more readily than if they had been from the middle class or the upper class. They were exposed to this music. And so Goodman fell in love with jazz, and I think I told you in an earlier lecture, even into the swing era, even though that was the music he was famous for, Goodman still loved that 1920s style jazz and tried to find opportunities to play that music when he could, because that was the music of his time. Now, with the onset of the Great Depression, remember I told you one of the advantages white musicians had was, quite frankly, the whiteness of their skin that allowed them the opportunity to play other kinds of music. So although jazz music was Benny Goodman's first love, the very end of the 20s and into the early 1930s, Goodman didn't find as many opportunities to play jazz because the market had largely dried up for jazz music. So he was playing weddings, he was playing society gigs. He was as proficient with classical music as he was with jazz, so he could play classical music, played at radio stations playing non-jazz music. Goodman did what he had to do to try to survive, but he still loved swing music or jazz music at the time. In the middle 30s, he moved to New York City, and we talked last time about him getting a radio program on the NBC network, the Let's Dance program, that helped him build a following. He created a band for that. But while he was in New York City, he was also playing with a fair number of African American musicians. Let me play one of them for you. This was a record that was produced by John Hammond. We're going to talk about John Hammond more when we get to our lecture on swing and politics. But Hammond was a producer. He did other things also, as we'll talk about. And one of the things Hammond liked to do is get black and white musicians together. He was very liberal, believed in racial equality, and so he would try to put on concerts with mixed race performers, white musicians and black musicians playing together. And he'd also tried to get them into the recording studio together too. And part of the reason he did that just because he loved music. And he got his favorite musicians, be they white, be they black, into the recording studio. And I'm going to play a song for you called I Wished on the Moon by Billie Holiday. It was with Teddy Wilson's band. Teddy Wilson was African American. We'll talk more about Teddy Wilson. And it's with Benny Goodman playing clarinet in this session. Billie Holiday, one of the greatest singers America's ever produced. Teddy Wilson, who's just was an amazing piano player. And Benny Goodman on clarinet. You see why John Hammond would want to put these musicians together again, and it's a really beautiful song. It's Teddy Wilson on the piano. Here's Goodman on the clarinet. This was recorded in 1934, 1935. I don't remember off the top of my head. Just right as Goodman's getting things together to start his band performing on NBC. Teddy Wilson and Benny Goodman going back and forth with this little improvisation that they intertwined. And then Billie Holiday.
I wished on the moon for something I never knew. Wished on the moon for more than I ever knew. A sweeter rose, a softer sky on April days that would not dance away.
I'll link something on for you guys in the lecture so you can listen to the rest of the song. It's an amazing song. All of those Billie Holiday sessions with the Teddy Wilson Orchestra in 1934 are so good. I highly recommend you putting it on your Spotify, wherever you get your music from these days. And so Goodman was already working with African American musicians as he's getting into New York. Ehrenberg has an interesting discussion about the fact that Benny Goodman was Jewish and talking about the American racial divide. The polarized nature of American race relations. And when Ehrenberg and I use this idea of polarized, we're using it in a very specific way, a kind of literal way, as in poles. That so much of American understanding of race, because of the long legacy of slavery and then afterwards segregation, saw race divided into simple black and white terms, one or the other. You were black or you're white, and very little in the way of being able to discuss or categorizing people that don't neatly fit into either of those categories. Okay. By the way, other cultures, other societies do have ways of talking about people that don't neatly fit into these. They have more subtle understandings of ideas of race, but American notions of race tend to be this very polarized, white or black. And that those people that don't fit have a hard time understanding. Traditionally, Jews didn't fit neatly into either one of these categories. On the one hand, they're clearly not black. They have nothing to do with African ancestry for the most part in terms of this. But also, Jews didn't fit neatly into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant understanding of what it means to be truly white. And because of this, gosh, sorry, very distracting. Historically, Jews in the United States have understood both sides of the racial fence in American history. On the one hand, Jews have the advantage of whiteness of skin, and therefore have often been able to pass in public. They could traditionally go into restaurants and eat wherever they want, unlike African Americans. They could go into buses or streetcars and sit anywhere on the bus or the streetcar, unlike African Americans in so many places. However, once it got beyond the anonymous environment of the public, once Jews had to apply for jobs, apply for schools, try to buy homes where their name and their background would be better understood, that's where the trouble started. Because when Shmuley Gottlieb tried to apply to university, the university understood that this is a Jew, and maybe we don't want that many Jews at our university, or maybe we don't want any Jews at all. When Shmuley Gottlieb applied for a job, his employer understood, oh, this person's Jewish. And he tried to buy a home where you had to provide your name. So historically, Jews have understood both the advantages that whiteness of skin offers to be able to often pass in public, but also they've known the sting of discrimination because of not anything they did, but simply because who they were. And because of this, Ehrenberg is trying to argue that Jews historically have served as a kind of almost translator between white and black Americans. That when we look at the history of the civil rights movement and the participation of people other than African Americans in the civil rights movement, often Jewish Americans were the most sympathetic people with white skin to the plight of African Americans. Not all Jews, not always, but because Jews had often experienced their own discrimination, it made a certain percentage of them more sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, because they understood that a world that an America that allowed more room for African Americans would also make more room for Jews. And the same kinds of people that tended to hate African Americans also tended to hate Jews. And what Ehrenberg in your book argues is that Benny Goodman in swing culture served this kind of traditional role of helping translate African American music to white audiences. That Goodman, because of his immigrant background, growing up very poor, growing up in close proximity to African Americans, learned to love jazz and learned how to approach jazz like many African American musicians approached jazz, and presented that music to the American public. And because of the whiteness of his skin, he was allowed to do so with greater ease than African American swing musicians like Duke Ellington or Count Basie. So think of Goodman as a kind of translator of black music to the larger American public. Benny Goodman falls into a tradition of white kings of popular music. It started with Paul Whiteman, who we talked about before, he was the king of jazz in the 1920s. Benny Goodman becomes the king of swing. That's how people started to refer to Benny Goodman in the 1930s and 40s. In the 1950s, Elvis Presley became the king of rock and roll. All of these musical forms were more associated with African Americans and African American innovations, but it was white people that were dubbed the kings of these music because the greater advantages that whiteness of skin afforded in terms of the music. Right? So think of Goodman as that bridge. That's what Ehrenberg tries to argue in here. Now, when it comes to musical culture, Ehrenberg in your book on Goodman talks about the way in which the problems of American race and segregation were not as were less problematic among musicians themselves. White and black musicians in the world of swing tended to get along really well, perform music, play together, learn from one another. Musicians share a literal language. Music is a language that when you get good at, you can communicate with other human beings through music. And black and white musicians, whatever other differences that they had, could understand each other through music. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that music is somehow a panacea and that once you get good at music, all racial or all racist instincts within you go away. No, that's not the case. Were there racist white musicians in swing culture? Sure there was. But when you compared this to broader American culture, it was so much better. It was so much better. And so much of the issue is that talented musicians recognize other talented musicians. This goes again, I had an earlier discussion comparing sports and music and how white Americans were willing to overlook issues of race when it came to music and sports because people tend to be rather fanatical about music and sports. Game recognizes game. Right? Good athletes recognize good athletes. Good chess players recognize other good chess players. And good musicians recognize other good musicians. All right? Game recognizes game. And so Ehrenberg in the book talks a lot about how even when there were obstacles in performing together in public, that white and black musicians got together. At other things. Going back to that Benny Goodman concert in 1938 at Carnegie Hall, Count Basie's band was in New York at the time for that show also. They were also performing in New York. So the guys from Basie's band, all African American, went to Benny Goodman's show at Carnegie Hall. And then after the show was over at Carnegie Hall, a bunch of the guys in Goodman's band went to go see Count Basie's band player. They were playing at the Savoy. And so Goodman's guys went to go and see Basie's band at the Savoy. And then after that was done, there were these after-hours jazz clubs that were smaller and usually had smaller bands that would play way into the early morning. And these were the after hours jazz places were for the really hardcore fans. And there was a lot of improvisation, a lot of just people getting up on stage and playing with one another. And some of the guys in Goodman's band, white guys, and some of the black guys in Goodman's band at the time. And some of the guys in Basie's band were jamming at these after hours clubs together. Again, all in one night or into the early morning of the next day. And so again, Ehrenberg talks about this as a kind of role model for a better America where people are treated in more equivalent ways and get to participate in more meaningful ways. That the problems of race were somewhat mitigated among the musicians of themselves because they shared the same language and they respected other people's talents here. Ehrenberg just tells you straight up in the chapter, the swing band itself was a better vision of an American society. If you think of a swing band as a microcosm, as a little society itself, you have all these different people, and they got to work together, and they got to participate, they got to cooperate, they got to help each other. But yet also with swing bands, remember, it's jazz music, so there's improvisation. And so at certain points, you get to be an individual in a swing band. You get to solo. You get to do your own thing. And then after your soloing is over, you become back as part of the group. You get communal again. And it's such a lovely metaphor for a better kind of society. And that's what Ehrenberg argues. And this bled out from just the musicians themselves to the broader swing culture and the fans themselves. Let me see. Ehrenberg, in your book, talking about the diversity of these bands, and not just white and black, but there was ethnic diversity. There were people from Irish and Polish backgrounds. There were Protestants. There was religious diversity. There were Protestants. There were Catholics. There were Jews. There was a degree of educational diversity. Sometimes these guys in these bands were college graduates, sometimes from even elite institutions. And then in the same band, there were guys that, dropped out of junior high. What they all shared, however, was being good musicians. What mattered was, could you play? That's what mattered. Not where you went to school, not necessarily the color of your skin. What mattered was, could you play? Game, recognized game. And so Ehrenberg, this is page, I think, 82 in your book. In bringing together Americans of diverse origins, the big swing bands fostered what Frank Sinatra called, quote, collaboration, brotherhood, and sharing rough times, end of quote. That he, the most popular singer of the 1940s, as the, quote, all-American Italian, this was still a time where Italians were discriminated against and looked down upon, but Frank Sinatra's success helped. And remember, Sinatra's success started with swing bands, as being the boy singer for swing bands. This was a movement in the right direction, okay, that an Italian American would be viewed so favorably. And that Helen O'Connell, Jimmy Dorsey's, quote, sweetheart singer, wore a crucifix in films and public appearances. The wearing of a cross in the 30s and 40s, that was mostly a Catholic thing. Okay, so Helen O'Connell came from an Irish immigrant background, Catholic background. Today it's common for Protestants to wear crosses, but that was very much a Catholic thing at this time. So he's trying to indicate that she was being accepted and not ashamed of, in fact, flaunting her Catholic background. Wore a crucifix in films and public appearances, demonstrated that swing offered an urban model of cultural pluralism as a new national ideal. Right? So it was, swing culture and music was broadening the idea of what it means to be an American. It was making it more inclusive. He goes on to begin the next paragraph here, where it says, in making black music the basis of swing, white musicians and band leaders, think of Benny Goodman in particular here from our discussion, as well as the audience who accepted that music, expanded the definition of American culture. Right? America is becoming more participatory. It was becoming more tolerant. Okay. Now, again, let's pump the brakes a little bit. This was music. This was swing culture. This did not single-handedly transform America into some kind of tolerant place. Okay. It was only music, and it was only swing culture. But in its own way, it was helping to make things better. All right? And that was important. Okay. Now let's talk about, this is all great. This is all good stuff. But let's talk about some of the limitations of this swing culture, because there were blind spots to how far this tolerance would be accepted. Okay, so first and foremost, let's state that yes, things were better for African Americans within swing culture, both for the musicians themselves and for young black swing fans in there. But that doesn't mean it was equivalent. That doesn't mean it was perfect. That doesn't mean it was a paradise. Black musicians continued to face discrimination. African American swing fans were not allowed to go into certain white dance halls and participate equally in other areas. Was it better than broader American culture? Yeah, it absolutely was better. Was it perfect? No. All right, so that's the first limitation worth talking about is, there's a reason Benny Goodman became the king of swing with the whiteness of his skin and not Duke Ellington and not Count Basie. There were still advantages to whiteness of skin. Another limitation has to do with gender. So I told you before, and Ehrenberg writes in your book about how, there was ethnic diversity in these backgrounds, in these big bands, Greek Americans, Pole Americans, Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, some bands. We'll talk more about the integration of bands in our unit on politics. Even African Americans in these bands. Your educational level didn't matter. Again, you could be a college graduate or you could be a junior high dropout. That didn't much matter. There were Northerners and Southerners, working class, poor, rich kids who played in swing bands. It didn't matter. If you could play your instrument, you could play your instrument. But gender was a big exception. Women did not really find many opportunities outside of being fans of the music or as being singers, that lone girl singer with a swing band. There wasn't much else for you. This picture right here is of Oneida O'Day. Oneida O'Day sang with various swing bands at the time, and her career lasted long afterwards. And she very much styled herself as a jazz musician, not just a girl singer, quote unquote, but as a jazz singer. Sort of lived that lifestyle too. She was something of a wild woman. In a lot of ways, she wasn't doing anything different from what male musicians were doing, which was drinking hard, taking drugs, having sex. What was so unique, or what stood out, what got so much attention, was that she was a woman. She had a problem with heroin for a long period of her life. Guess what? So did a lot of jazz musicians of the time. But she stood out somewhat because she was, in fact, a woman. Let's listen to something from Oneida O'Day while we're here. This is from something she was playing with Stan Kenny's orchestra.
He would spend it on the ponies, he would spend it on the girls, buy his mother gin and roses for her poor old headed curls. But when his wife said, hey...
Okay, not my favorite song in the world, but I wanted to get you something from the 1940s with her. A lot of her best stuff, and she was a great singer, was from sort of after the big band era. In fact, as soon as she could get away from the big bands and the limitations, she did for good reasons. Because Ehrenberg writes about big bands as a kind of homosocial environment, an all-male dominated environment. Instrument-playing musicians tend to look down upon singers. They don't think singers are musicians like themselves. To learn how to play an instrument, requires a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of time put in there. And instrument playing musicians often look at singers as people who just one day opened their mouth and beautiful sound came out, and that's all they ever had to do. Often that's a very unfair understanding of singing, because some singers work as hard at their craft as instrument playing musicians. But nonetheless, often instrument playing musicians just don't think of singers as, doing the same stuff as they did. And so female singers weren't treated with the same respect, and nor did they get the kind of opportunities. And now I'm talking about instrument playing female musicians to play in big bands. Think of World War II. We're going to talk all about World War II and swing music in a later lecture. But think of World War II, where so many millions of American women went to work during World War II and did all kinds of jobs traditionally women didn't do during the war effort. Swing bands were hit also hard during the World War II. Musicians that played in these swing bands volunteered and were drafted and went off to war, and there was a tremendous scarcity of talented musicians. But most of these swing bands would not put women into their band. They just refused. They didn't care what level of school you went to. They didn't necessarily care if you were a Jew or a Protestant or a Catholic. They were willing to overlook whether you were white or you were black. But when it came to women, no. You can be the solo singer. You can be the girl singer. You can be the canary. But nothing else. It was a real blind spot in this. What tolerance there was in swing culture was a tolerance that just really wasn't willing to extend out to women. Okay. That doesn't mean that women didn't make the best of what they could. Because in the 30s and 40s, these female singers in swing bands became quite famous, and many built solo careers after the swing era ended. One we could talk about to end things today is Peggy Lee. Peggy Lee started singing with various swing bands, most famously Benny Goodman's swing band. And Peggy Lee went on to build a rather amazing career. She grew up in an abusive home, left home at 14, was very shy and introverted when she was young, struggled with self-confidence, and yet overcame this and went on to become a really sort of bold and ahead of her time female performer. She went on to write songs, which was unusual for singers of that generation. Frank Sinatra didn't write his own songs at this time, but she started to write her own songs and hold on to the publishing rights, which meant she held on to the money that she made. She created her own publishing company. She really broke a lot of boundaries. Now let's listen to a little Peggy Lee. We're gonna talk about this song later on when we talk about World War II. It's called "Waiting for the Train to Come In."
Waiting for the train to come in, waiting for my man to come home. I've counted every minute of each livelong day, been so melancholy since he went away. I've shed a million teardrops or more, waiting for the one I adore. I'm waiting in the depot by the railroad track, looking for the choo-choo train that brings him back. I'm waiting for my life to begin, waiting for the train to come in.
Love me some Peggy Lee. That song was recorded during World War II, and the idea of a man coming home from a train and starting your life again would really resonate. We'll talk about that more later on. So despite the limitations that were placed on these female performers, these singers in the swing era, some of them made the best of them, built careers. And somebody like Peggy Lee in the 30s and 40s could be a role model for girls and young women to aspire to something potentially more than just being a wife, just being a mother, for those women that wanted something more. There weren't that many examples of public women, and these singers could be. And these singers also developed reputations as really, tough chicks. Because think of what they had to live through. They had to travel around the country in buses filled with men, and all the things they would have to deal with to do it. And so unlike movie stars, these female singers in these swing bands often developed reputations as very strong women, independent women, and would be an important role model example for others. Okay, that's a good place to stop for this lecture, everybody. I'll see you next time. Take care.